Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. And have you ever heard the term Finnish Mosin before? What about Finnish capture? There's a lot of terms that get thrown around when it comes to Mosins from Finland. We're going to help answer the question today, what is a Finnish Mosin? Now, in order to do that, we need to take a step back in time to the year 1809, in fact. You see, in 1809, the Grand Duchy of Finland was formed. And this is important because before this, Finland was actually a part of Sweden. Sweden controlled all of it. And then around 1809, we would see Russia come, and they would actually conquer all that territory up through the current borders of Finland, the border between Finland and Sweden today. Now, Russia conquered modern-day Finland, and it sort of became this autonomous state thing. It's actually a really interesting topic to talk about, but what's important here to know is that the Tsar ruled as sort of the Grand Duke of Finland. Now, you might ask, Big Sam, what does 1809 have to do with Mosins? Well, we're getting to that. Now, this is important because starting in 1809, Finland was actually a part of Russia. So when we move forward to 1917, we would see the Russian Revolution happen. And this is when some things would start to go a little bit haywire, and well, really all Europe was already kind of going haywire. This was just not good for a lot of people in a lot of places. What's actually ironic, though, is in all the terror and just the huge mess that was caused by the Russian Revolution, everyone else in Eastern Europe was busy beating up each other's, faces, and people punching each other in the faces all throughout up and down the Ukraine and everywhere else. It was not good. But Finland was over there looking around and saying, looks like these guys are just sort of going crazy and doing their own thing. We're going to declare our independence from all of this mess. So they did. And what ended up happening was another civil war sparked, just like we would see a Russian civil war spark between the whites and the reds. The same thing happened in Finland. So what's interesting here, though, is that the result in Finland was the opposite of the result in Russia. See, in Russia, the Reds, the communists, the Bolsheviks, ended up winning over the whites. But in Finland, it was a little bit different. You see, in Finland, there was a man named General Mannerheim in charge of the white resistance against the Reds, the communists. And Mannerheim was actually a really genius general, and he was able to overcome all of the communists and really just wipe them out. And so what would end up happening is, come around 1919, we would see that Finland is actually its own autonomous state, its own country, really, because they are now totally independent from Russia and really the Soviet Union. And so they looked around, and then they said, well, we kind of need an army. So they looked around at what they had, and what they actually had, and you can probably guess this, was a whole lot of Mosin Nagants, okay? And the reason for this, again, and this is why it was important to talk about Russia's influence in Finland, is because there was a lot of Russian troops around Finland in about 1918 or thereabouts, right? And what also would happen is there was lots of stockpiles and armories, Russian armories in Finland at the time. A lot of those were actually raided by both the whites and the reds during the Finnish Civil War. And what this leads us to is a whole amassment of Mosin Nagants, specifically what we're looking at here today, the M91 rifle. Now, this rifle is quite an old thing. It was originally introduced in 1891, and it was used by pretty much everyone and their brother throughout all of Europe, it seems like, even through World War II. It's not a particularly great rifle, especially as Finland would find out. The M91 rifle is kind of the bad girlfriend of small arms during the 1920s through the 1940s in Europe. It's not that great. It's sort of problematic. A lot of people really dislike it, and it just keeps popping up everywhere. Now, this worked out great for Finland because they actually started amassing these. And that brings up another question, though. Why would Finland want this? And that's actually a really good question, because they had other things as well. You see, after the Finnish Civil War, they actually had an amassment of Gewehr 98 rifles, Type 30 Arisaka rifles, the Carabiner 98 rifles from World War I. They had a lot of decent rifles, but they also had a lot of Mosin Nagants. So why did they go with the Mosin? Well, that's a great question, and there's a couple of good reasons why they would want to do this. One, this was probably the most prevalent rifle they had, even though it probably wasn't the best rifle they had. The other thing is we have to look around at who their enemy was. While they had declared their independence from Russia, I think they sort of knew in the back of their head that this fight wasn't over, and they would actually find that out come November 30th of 1939, when the Winter War would start. But that's 20 years off from where we're at right now, in 1919. But Finland wasn't dumb. They knew that the Russians would end up invading them again at some point, or they would get another fight with them. So, one of the great things about that is you're a really small country, and if you end up having to fight somebody, it actually is really great to have the same standardized, arms and ammunition that your enemy does, because if you can capture their ammo or their weapons, it's identical to what you're using. And so that can really play into your favor, especially when you don't have a lot of money, which was a huge other problem that Finland faced during the early 1920s. And really even up through the end of the Winter and Continuation Wars, they didn't really have any money. So they looked around in Europe and said, well, a lot of other people have Mosin Nagants. And here's the other thing. You look at this rifle, and it's probably the worst standard issue rifle of World War I. I mean, it's better than some horrible things like the 6.5 Carcano Italian Vetterli rifles or the French Gras rifles or things like that. But as a modern bolt-action infantry rifle in World War I, this was probably the worst rifle. It's just, the action's not very good. It's just very heavy. It's stupidly long. To give you an idea of how long this rifle actually is, these are supposed to be with a bayonet. You can see how long this rifle is. It doesn't even have a bayonet on it. With a bayonet, it's almost as tall as Big Sam is. So this is just a ridiculously long rifle. So you'd think that, wow, if a country had this, they would probably do anything they would want to do in order to get rid of it or trade it for something else. So a really interesting thing happened at the end of World War I when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. You see, a whole bunch of people ended up with Mosin Nagants as war reparations. You could also call it war trophies, but I'm not sure how many people involved in the Treaty of Versailles would call this abomination a trophy. Although here on the channel, we absolutely love these rifles. A lot of people ended up with Mosins simply because, especially in 1915, when the German Empire, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were fighting the Russians, they would capture thousands upon thousands of this particular rifle. In fact, if we take a closer look at this rifle, see right here, this particular rifle was actually captured by Germany during the First World War. Now that's important here to remember as we're talking about this. So, so Germany captured a whole bunch of these, and a lot of other countries did. And then you would also have these countries in sort of weird scenarios like Italy, because a lot of Mosins were captured by the Austro-Hungarians, and the Austro-Hungarians were also fighting the Italians, so the Austro-Hungarians would use these captured rifles against the Italians, and then the Italians would capture them again, and then the Italians had these, and they said, well, what do we do with this junk, right? They probably couldn't really care less about these rifles. So Italy would get Mosins, they'd capture them, they would also get them as war reparations. And you'd have to look at that and say, well, why would Italy want any of this, right? So this is a recurring theme. This would also happen in places like Poland, Serbia. France even had an amassment of Mosin Nagants. What would France want to do with this, right? Have you ever heard of a Mosin Nagant converted to 8mm Lebel? Well, I haven't, and I think there's probably a good reason for that. So Finland was looking around at these places, and they probably thought, we don't have any money, and we've got all this other junk that we can trade, and we could probably get a pretty good deal on trading these rifles, because we've got rifles like Mauser rifles that a lot of other countries would really like to have. And they have a bunch of Mosin Nagants that they really probably could live without, quite frankly. So here, out of all this comes a whole mess of trades. And it would be trades that actually worked great for both countries. So, places like Serbia would get Mausers or 8mm ammo, things like that, where they could actually use them because that's what their army was using. And then Finland could get rifles that they actually wanted because that was their standardized rifle. So in 1918, the Mosin Nagant M91 became the standard infantry rifle of the Finnish army. And throughout the 1920s and even in the 1930s, and a few in the 1940s with Germany, we would see Finland, through dealings, acquire all sorts of M91s from just everybody and their brother. And that's what we have here today. So when we talk about what is a Finnish Mosin, really what we're talking about is three different categories. The first category is going to be rifles that Finland bought. This would be the first way they acquired Mosin Nagants. And that's what we have here. This would be a rifle that Finland bought, most likely. Again, this is a German-captured rifle, so chances are this rifle was captured by Germany, then potentially was given out to a country, Italy, France, Serbia, Poland, we don't really know, as war reparations. And then sometime in the 19-teens or 1920s, probably in the 1920s or the 1930s, really, this rifle would have been acquired from whatever that country was. And Finland would have traded, 8mm ammo or machine guns or Mauser rifles or Arisaka rifles for this particular rifle. And as Finland started getting these rifles, they were not really happy with some of the problems we stated earlier. Originally, these rifles were sighted in with a bayonet on. So if you had an original one of these in World War I, and you were to shoot it without a bayonet, what would happen is it would shoot probably way high and off somewhere you did not want to shoot at. Not good. And some people just couldn't really fathom this. One in particular country I feel really bad for during World War I is Montenegro. You see, they basically got pummeled during World War I. But before that happened, they were given an amassment of Mosin Nagant rifles just like this M91 rifle from Russia. Unfortunately, they didn't bother sending any bayonets with them. So Montenegro ended up receiving a whole amassment of M91s with no bayonets. And they probably did not shoot very well at all. So they had to figure out some way to adjust the sights or do something with that. Poor Montenegro. But that's another story for another day. Finland, though, would actually realize this and make a few modifications. Let's take a look at those now. So the first modification would be over here. So see this rear sight marking? On a standard M91 rifle, the rear sight markings will say 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. 12 there. What is that? Well, these are actually, this is actually a measurement called arshins. This is also going to get very strange. You see, Imperial Russia didn't use the metric system. They used really old units of measurement. So an arshin is a pace, and it's about 0.7 meters. So this sight setting here, 400 arshins, which was like the shortest distance the sight setting you would have, is about 280 meters. So quite a long way away. Most combat was probably closer than that in World War I. Certainly a lot of it was. So these guns tended to just not quite shoot where you wanted them to. You kind of had to figure out where they hit and use some Kentucky windage. Now, Finland didn't like the concept of Kentucky windage. They wanted a rifle to shoot where it points. So what we can see here is there's a little extra notch here, okay? We look around on this side. One of the earliest modifications Finland would do here is they would modify the rear sight and they would renumber the right side with metric units. So here's meters. So they would renumber these. So this sight setting, remember we said 280 meters? They said it was 300. Close enough, right? They would also make this little notch here. Do you see this little notch right here that the sight's on right now? That was not originally there when this rifle was produced in 1901. This notch right here was actually added by Finland, so they cut a little extra notch there. So that is your 200 meter setting. And we can see it's marked 2 right here. Another interesting thing and quirk about units of measurement in Russia and Finland was the fact that Finland, who was actually part of Russia, actually adopted the metric system a lot earlier than you might think. They didn't adopt the metric system after the Finnish Civil War. Finland officially adopted the metric system in 1880. Now that's very interesting because they were still having to use these rifles with a different sight setting. Even though they were sort of their own autonomous state, they really weren't. Russia, or the Soviet Union, didn't actually adopt the metric system until 1925, so 45 years after Finland. So Finland actually started using the metric system before the Soviet Union did. This adjustment of the sights here was actually done starting around 1919. One of the other things they had to do was make a taller front sight. So we can see here, this front sight is actually from Finland and is much taller than the original one. This is to help prevent the rifle from shooting too high. Now, one interesting tidbit is that the man who actually came up with these modifications was none other than Aimo Lahti himself, a name you've probably heard of. He's famous for making many guns, including the LS-26 machine gun, which you may be familiar with from the video game Battlefield 5. So he actually cut his teeth working on the Mosin Nagant front sights. So from 1919 to around the mid-1920s, Finland would perform this conversion on about 66,000 rifles from what we know. And then after that is when they would start, doing all these horse trading for other Mosins from other people. And as they got these new rifles later, they would then, once they had the rifle, they would then retrofit it with these sight modifications. So this is the first type of rifle that you should think of when you hear Finnish Mosin. A Mosin Nagant bought by Finland. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this series, What is a Finnish Mosin? Stay tuned for next time, where we'll be talking about part 2, which is going to be taking a look at Mosin Nagants built by Finland. So I hope y'all stay tuned for that. Thank y'all for watching. Let me know if you have any prayer requests, and I'll see you next time.